Epilogue. Oh, you're back, I see. How was it then? Lorraine's voice was the first thing I heard as I opened the doors to her abode, finally having returned from the Stheno Trading Company. Lorraine's voice. I was finally back home. Such was the emotion that had welled up from the bottom of my heart. I'd crossed a rather precarious bridge this time. Even I understood that. Perhaps I'd been a little careless, but it was simply not possible to imagine such a chain of events. I was only heading off to sell some materials. It was as rare as a meteor falling on my head as I walked on the open streets of Malt. Even if nothing had happened to me this time, that woman, Nive, had quite the intuition when it came to sniffing out vampires. We would surely cross paths again someday. Quite a few unexpected things happened, but I'm fine. What? Have you gotten yourself embroiled in some strange affair again? Lorraine said, an expression of mild irritation on her face. She did, however, seem willing to listen to what I had to say. In any case, come sit down and speak your mind. Nive Maris, and a priestess saint of the Church of Lobelia, easily individuals you would not want to cross paths with, Rent, no matter how you think about it. Lorraine sighed as I finished explaining most of the situation. I nodded in response. Honestly, it's as you say, but Nive had a special technique to detect vampires, or so she claims. It had no effect on me whatsoever. Perhaps I could say I was lucky this time.
Ah, yes.
That holy fire you had mentioned, no? I have seen a practitioner of it back in my hometown. At the time, it was seen as a very rare technique, zealously guarded by the churches. As such, the details were hazy to say that least, but it was quite interesting when I set about investigating it. Alas, no one would tell me a thing, even if I did inquire. To begin with, it is said that those who do not have any blessings of divinity are unable to see it. Yes? That would mean the practitioner back at my hometown had made it, so their flames would be visible. I had requested that it be shown to me, so I may understand the underlying mechanics of it better, but they would not cooperate, you see. On another note, Rent, that detection technique had no effect on you? Even if you are indeed some sort of vampire, no. Even I couldn't really answer that question. Nive had confidently claimed she was able to detect and discover vampires without fail. If I were to accept that truth for what it was and expand on that train of thought, maybe I'm not a vampire at all? I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. Lorraine pondered upon this for a while, too, before offering her opinion. Not impossible, I would say. To begin with, Rent, there is no way for us to affirm that you really are a vampire. Skeleton, ghoul, thrall, vampire. Visually, you've been evolving from one undead monster to the next, yes? All we did was assume that you may be some sort of vampire. You were not very much of a standard skeleton even back when you were a pile of walking bones. Taking all that into consideration, Rent, it is hardly impossible. Lorraine did have a point, albeit a pointed, difficult one. As she said, I didn't know very much about my existence as I was right now, and that was how I'd honestly put it. Was I a monster?
Was I not?
The lines were vague and ambiguous at best. I really had no idea. But based on what we'd observed thus far, the likelihood of me being a monster was indeed high. If anything, I was a monster of some kind if the current line of reasoning was to be believed. If I were to turn that around and consider what Lorraine had said, though, was I simply a skeleton-like being but not actually a skeleton since the very beginning? At that rate, no explanations would prove satisfactory. In that case, my predictions for the future would hinge on the progress I'd made up until this point. Regardless of all that, I'd been evolving this entire time, much like the existential evolution of monsters. That much was fine, it would be a reference of sorts, if nothing else. Lorraine had spent far more time pondering upon that topic as opposed to me. It may be a little late for this particular commentary, Rent, but we already knew from the beginning that you were different than the average monster. You mentioned it just now, no? That divinity has no effect on you. That would be because you are special, Rent. That is the obvious conclusion. Knowing that much may just be enough at this point. The next most obvious possibility would be the fact that you were blessed with reserves of divinity, unlike the typical undead. Could that not be the cause? Divinity, huh? According to Nive, Vampires were weak to divinity. There was simply no way a vampire that utilized divine powers existed. I, however, was able to wield my divinity just fine. As to why I was still able to use it even after becoming a vampire-like creature, I had no idea. Perhaps it was a trait carried over, as I had used it in life? At the very least, the sensations and feelings I experienced while using divinity hadn't changed one bit. Of that I could be sure. Was Lorraine suggesting that merely possessing divinity within oneself made one impervious to it, even if it was used on me by others? Holy fire supposedly caused great pain to vampires, if Knives' words were to be believed. I hardly felt that way about divinity at all. Was that why it didn't work? Because I was some special vampire-like existence, but not quite a vampire at all? That did seem easier to believe. Lorraine continued, "It is the same way for poisons, magic, and the like, no? If an individual has a resistance of some kind, said attacks would be ineffective or nullified. That much is to be understood. Simple, yes? Rent, from what I recall, your divinity came from you repairing an old shrine back in your hometown, no? I described to Lorraine a while ago about why I was blessed with divinity in the first place. It wasn't a big deal, so I had no reason to hide it. Among the friends I had in life, few individuals knew I was blessed with all three powers. It was incredibly rare, but I was unable to develop my potential. Or perhaps I was simply a jack of all trades. Such was the case in the past. It was, by all means, quite the accurate description.
Yes.
It was quite run down. In fact, it had been mostly swallowed up by the trees in the forest. Its existence wasn't even known to the greater half of the villagers in my hometown. It was a bit of a pity, I thought. So I somehow got rid of the shrubbery around it, cleaned it up, and mended whatever parts that were broken. It took me a while, but this was before I had become an adventurer. I had a great amount of free time. You say it's so simply, Rent, that you fixed a shrine, and that was that. Quite some skill was required for that, despite what you say, no. A carpenter from the village taught me what I needed to know. I had an eye for detail and precision. I had learned the basics relatively quickly, and the rest was just trial and error. It was good training, to say the least. Capable as ever, I see. Even so, you lacked the capacity to progress as an adventurer, of all things. The gods are cruel, no. I wouldn't really say so, no. After all, I'm now more than capable of aiming for the top. Perhaps the gods were actually relatively merciful in my case. You are far too positive, Rent. But alas, that is indeed one of your good traits. But you said it was a shrine, yes? What god was it built in dedication to? Well, I didn't really have a concrete answer. I don't know. It was a shrine no one visited, after all. Perhaps the village elders would know something about it. Is that right? Well, then, Rent, should we make a trip to this village of yours? Lorraine said, suddenly, and without warning.